With this video, I'm going to retire this opening animation that I've used in previous videos, partly because I like starting things quicker, also because I feel that this video on its own will explain the meaning of this sentence. The only stories in games are the ones we tell. What this means is that video games are a storytelling medium, only the stories, at least most of the stories that are worth telling, are not generally things embedded in the game by traditional narrative design, like plot and characters. As much as game designers try to tell stories in their games, if we were to tell a story of a game we played, we're not telling a story in the same way. The story of a game is the story of our experience playing it, as it should be. This is one of the things that distinguishes games from other media. You could say the same about other storytelling media. You read a book and you could say, the story of this book is the story of my reading it. Or in other audio or visual arts, the story of this painting or this symphony is the story of my looking at it or listening to it. But there's a difference. The story of a video game is what we tell about the choices we made playing it. The choices we make, not the choices that an artist or a designer made. Because of this, video games don't really need cinematics or complicated story elements to be fully interactive. It's nice to see, especially in a role-playing game, but it's not necessary. We might even get impatient with games that have too much plot and long cinematics. If we spend most of our time watching cutscenes, the game isn't really a game. But with only the barest sign of narrative, some games can be endlessly playable and replayable. One of these games is the 2019 roguelike deck builder Slay the Spire, developed by Megacrit. I can honestly say that I've never spent more time playing a single video game in my entire life. There are very few games besides this one that make me want to talk about my experience playing it and to learn about how other people play it. This despite only having the barest smidgen of narrative-based content. Slay the Spire is a combination of a roguelike game and a card deck building game. Roguelike refers to a game made up of a run through pre-designed challenges that are, at first, guaranteed to kill the player character. The manner of death is intended to teach the player how to improve in the next run. Trial and error, basically. I wouldn't call this the most pleasurable of genres. It's for the player who wants to be challenged and frustrated and pushed to the breaking point. I have quit more roguelikes than I can count. I just don't have the patience for most of them. I need to enjoy it enough to not mind losing. If I don't enjoy it, like in West of Dead or The Binding of Isaac, or so many more, I'll quit pretty early. The idea of a game that is essentially a series of suicide runs isn't all that appealing to me. It seems like only a world-class elite player can achieve some sort of endgame without much trouble. The rest of us schlubs aren't meant to beat the games. We're meant to enjoy the gameplay itself and to keep hitting restart to see how far we'll get this time. This is why combining the roguelike with the deck builder, as in Slay the Spire, is so ingenious. The stakes don't change. You can still die instantly from making the tiniest of errors. But you have time to make choices. Which cards to add to the deck, which cards to play, which cards to remove from the deck, and so forth. Success in the game is more dependent on precise mathematical calculations than it is on pushing buttons at the precise time. In that respect, you could say deck builders are a more relaxed version of the roguelike when the two are combined. That's not to say Slay the Spire is a stress-free game. Far from it. Slay the Spire is as punishing as any roguelike. Failure is permanent. Success is impermanent. You can win a combat and then pick the wrong card as a reward. And you won't know it's the wrong card until you draw it at the wrong time against the wrong enemy. Just because the game waits for you to make those choices doesn't make the choice any easier. In fact, having the ability to think about every choice makes losing the game that much more frustrating. But it's the story of the game that interests me. What is the story? Is there a story? Of course there is, but it's not something you tell the same way you tell the story of a movie or a novel. If you were to do that, you'd say something like this. Slay the Spire is about a spire. It's occupied by monsters. It has dozens of floors. The player character enters each floor to have either a combat encounter, a campfire for resting or improving your deck, or a randomly generated event that could give your player character benefits or drawbacks. There are 4 player characters, of which you choose 1 for an entire run. These player characters are based on classic archetypes of fantasy role-playing games. There is the Ironclad, a warrior class character specializing in strength attacks. There is the Silent, a more defensive character with strong dexterity and burst attacks like shivs and poison. Then there is the Defect, a robot specializing in power orbs. Finally, there is the Watcher, a mage-like character who practices rapid-fire stance switching from calm to wrath. That is the grand total of player character design in this game. These 4 characters have no specific names and never meet each other. The game never explains why they attack the spire, except that there are monsters in there. Monsters who, as far as we know, aren't really bothering anybody outside of the spire. The world building in this game is so basic it's comical. Or really, what more do you need? Here's the place where fights happen. Here is the fighter controlled by the player. Here are the monsters the player has to fight. If the player wins, they go to the next floor. If they lose, it's game over. After about 50 floors, there is the final challenge, at the end of which, if the player loses, it's game over. If the player wins, it's still game over. The only definitive victory occurs at the end of Act 4, an optional path that a player can take after gathering 3 keys from previous acts. Act 4 has only 2 encounters, but they are doozies, especially the last one, the Corrupt Heart. Only by defeating this monstrosity can you see a true game over, with the player victorious. For most of us, this is a rare occurrence. So, not much of a story, really. Dialogue is as spare as it gets. Monsters only communicate in silent word bubble taunts. Player characters don't speak at all, even in word bubbles. Music and sound effects fill in the silent gaps. The story of the game, therefore, is this: how each player figures out in the course of playing the game just how much of its randomness is acceptable. So many options are randomly generated. The maps of each act, the monsters that appear, the cards and relics that are offered at the ends of combats and in shops. All of these options are procedurally generated through a wide range of possibilities. Even the shuffling of your own deck and the drawing of cards every turn is randomly generated. Given all of this, I would say it is just about impossible for a player to win this game the first time it's played. Only after playing the game multiple times do you figure out the range of possibilities from which enemies, cards, and relics are likely to appear. Your choices are therefore more educated the next time around. Some players are okay with this and willing to take numerous losses simply to learn more about all the options that could open up in the course of a run. For example, at the end of each act, a boss appears. This boss is one of 3 that may appear. You're told at the beginning of the act which boss it is. But how will you know what that boss does unless you play that act enough times to encounter all 3 bosses, in order to learn about the 9 bosses and their attack and defense patterns? These patterns in turn affect the choices you make during the act in order to prepare to fight this specific boss. It gets even deeper with elite monsters who appear in each act. There are also 3 of those for each act, only you don't know which will appear when you click on that evil horned smiling face. You don't have to fight elites if the map has an alternate path to the top, but not fighting elites means not winning enough gold and relics and rare cards that are necessary to defeat the bosses, who cannot be skipped. But, and this is the real challenge of the game, even if you defeat an elite or any other monster, that doesn't mean the card rewards or relics offered will actually help your deck. You can survive a brutal encounter and then have no choice but to skip all the rewards if they don't help your deck. Skipping rewards? Now that's random. A lot of players find the randomness of the game unfair. Their stories are usually quite short. They played it for a bit, hated the randomness, and quit. Me, I found the randomness of the game to be the most addictive element. the thing that kept me coming back to it after hundreds of losses. Where will this randomness take me? If I lose a game, is it because I made the wrong choices, or was I just not meant to win it? If I won a game, is it because I'm smart or lucky? In the end, I have to figure out the meaning of this game, and that meaning feels unique to me. This is why I think Slay the Spire says more about the art of video game storytelling than a more narrative-based game like Mass Effect or Yakuza. My experience with Slay the Spire may not be unique, but it feels that way. With Mass Effect and Yakuza, when something dramatic happens, I know that millions of other players have experienced exactly the same situation. With Slay the Spire, no single game is the same, and therefore no single player's experience is the same as any others. Every player of Slay the Spire has a unique story to tell. My story boils down to this. At first, I tried to set goals and reach them. I thought I could take on the toughest challenges, overcome those challenges, and then quit. Then, when that proved to be way beyond my abilities, I thought I should just quit. But how to quit? What would be a satisfying end to the story? Many people quit this game out of pure frustration, or a fear of addiction, or they think they've simply plateaued their characters and can't progress any higher. I have quit this game out of frustration, only to be pulled back in when I realized how much of this game I didn't understand. Then I quit out of a fear of addiction, only to be pulled back in when I realized this is something I want to analyze. If I had to give this kind of story a genre, I guess I'd call it an autobiography, the story of my own experience with this game. How I tried to create a survival scenario for my various avatars given the mathematical possibilities of card values versus opponent values, an experience laden with the constant uncertainty of the long-term benefits of my various choices. A single roll of the digital dice could end my run in an instant. It could also win my run in an instant. The mystery at the heart of this game is not why these characters are invading the Spire. The mystery is why and how anyone would play a game like this. The design of the game is such that if I lose a run, I have to figure out if that's a result of choices that I made in a winnable scenario, or the result of randomness through no fault of my own that made the run unwinnable. According to Megacrit, every game of Slay the Spire, every seed that is created by hitting play and generating a random set of variables, is winnable. But that's taking into account the entirety of what is offered over the course of the whole run. It does not take into account the sequence of choices that a player has to make, each of which closes off all other options at that time. How would a player know, for example, that the Chemical X relic, which gives players an extra 2 draws of any X-cost card, would be offered in a shop just before an X-cost card is offered at the end of the next combat? The player who chooses Chemical X, even though it offers no immediate benefit, can rejoice at seeing the X-cost card a minute later, and thank the RNG gods for delivering it. The player who does not spend precious gold on Chemical X in the shop, because there was no reason to do so at the time, can only gripe with annoyance upon seeing that X-cost card offered later. Those two things together, Chemical X and an X-cost card, create a powerful synergy that can win the run in various ways. But the ideal way to get those two things is to get the X-cost card first and then the relic. If they're offered the other way around, it's much less likely a player will be choosing it. Now that gameplay option is closed off. Not because the player made a bad choice, but because of the randomly generated sequence in which those two things were offered. There could have been a perfectly valid reason for not buying Chemical X at the time it was offered. From a macro point of view, this run does offer the player a perfectly winnable scenario with Chemical X and the X-cost card offered in sequence. From a micro point of view, by offering them in that particular order, this run forces the player either to make a wild guess that this relic will pay off later and go ahead and buy it, or do the smart thing and not buy it because it had no immediate benefit, only to realize that that smart decision actually created a less winnable scenario. This logic of game design, that every run is macro winnable but micro losable, is the source of its amazing simultaneity, of stimulating encouragement and downright infuriating unfairness. With the same hand, it knocks you down and then picks you up, and then knocks you down again. This is what kept me going after every defeat, the idea that every run could have been a win if only I'd done this or that. So let's try another roll of the dice and see what comes up. Surely I'd get better at this. And I did get better. Or maybe I just got luckier. Even casinos have winners who beat the odds. That's what keeps people coming back. In games of chance, somebody has to win. You just have to be there when fortune arrives. If you still have money to play with, that is. Luckily, dying in Slay the Spire doesn't cost you money. And Megacrit, I have to say, is a wonderful developer for not having any feature in the game that gives players advantages if they spend more money on it. There are no loot boxes or special cards that you can purchase. The game does, however, cost you time, and depending on your tolerance for this sort of design, it may also drain your patience. As much as I want to see this game as harmless entertainment, I can't help thinking that there's something seriously wrong with it. The problem with Slay the Spire and other games like it is, the more you play, the harder it gets. And unlike more narratively focused video games, an increase in difficulty doesn't come with an increase in player abilities. No matter if it's your first game or if it's your 1000th run at Ascension level 20, your player character starts at the bottom. This increases the stress on the player to focus on every turn, every decision, and the only reward is more hard choices and decisions. There is no actual mastery of Slay the Spire. If you want to progress, or ascend as the game puts it, you are basically surrendering to the game and its terms. It gives nothing. As you ascend, you accumulate knowledge and skill, but that only gets you so far. You are dependent on the cards and the relics that are offered over the course of that run. These are not given to the player, although it might seem that way. They are actually demands on the player. You are demanded to make choices at every floor, which of these cards and relics to pick and play. Yes, you can skip all of them, but your run isn't likely to last very long if you skip too many. This makes winning and losing the result of limited and largely unpredictable options. The ultimate outcome of a run is almost less important than the choices made at key moments earlier in the run. During a very typical run, you begin with a deck that simply cannot win. And then with every decision you make afterwards, you re-evaluate the deck's capability of winning. At some point late in the run, usually by the beginning of Act 3, you know if the deck is ready to win or not. This has a major impact on how you feel at the end of a run. If you thought the deck was winnable and you lose, that feels much worse than losing with a deck you already thought was unwinnable. Top-tier players like Jorbs or Baylorlord on Twitch and YouTube also experience this. These players often pinpoint the exact moment when they know the deck is ready. But that doesn't always pan out. Jorbs recently had a defect run that went about as smoothly as a typical Jorbs run until the Corrupt Heart showed up. Jorbs gets the worst possible card draws and spends over 20 minutes trying to figure out how to win this fight. One of the greatest players in the world cannot beat this game's randomness if it doesn't go his way. After dying, Jorbs told his audience, "That was a winnable run." I know how that feels. I've had what I thought were many winnable runs, and very often the game simply disagreed with that. It said, no, I did not have a winnable run, even though I did. When a deck comes together nicely with cards synergizing like crazy and a dazzling display of pyrotechnics, you feel like a genius. Just watching this, you think, well, that worked quite well that one time. But what was the difference between that run and other runs? Did I suddenly become a genius? Or did I just make the choices I would have always made, only this time I could choose from a more favorable set of variables? In that sense, a win feels less like genius and more like dumb luck. I mean, how do you explain why one player who isn't particularly interested in this sort of game, that's me, can have streaks like this, a run history up the Ascension chain that starts with a winning streak up to Ascension 4, then has a terrible losing streak that sometimes can't even get out of Act 1, and then have a winning streak of several in a row? And these are all runs that defeated the Corrupt Heart, the toughest challenge in the game. How to explain this except, well, you're lucky and then you're not. Losing a run with this sort of design creates a kind of frustration that I don't think any other type of game can manage. At higher ascensions, a loss is usually the result of making one wrong choice, or simply having a lot of bad options. When the game gives you no high damage attack cards to choose from at the start, you are highly unlikely to get through the first act without playing very conservatively and hoping the game drops something just in time for you to survive the first act boss. But when you actually have a good deck and you feel like you're walking on air, and you're slaying enemies left and right, and then suddenly you meet the wrong enemy at the wrong time. You play the wrong card, maybe you even accidentally hit the end turn button, and that's the end. I would say that anyone continuing to play the game after that experience has to come to terms with the emotional effect that that has. And knowing how or why you lost doesn't make it any less frustrating. If you know you lost because of a single mistake or because the game didn't offer what you needed at the time that you needed it, then really what's the point? Winning doesn't mean that you're smart, and losing doesn't mean you're stupid. And since there is no narrative or emotional connection to the game besides winning and losing, the entire game is basically an exercise in making choices that you can't really know for sure are good or bad until the run is decided in a win or a loss. The meaning of choices. Games that are more narrative-based give you immediate story-based consequences of your choices as a player. Slay the Spire leaves that meaning open, unresolved until the final points are scored. Then it's up to the player to decide what that was all about. For me, what Slay the Spire is all about after all the hundreds of hours I've spent mastering the mechanics, racking up wins and losses across 4 characters and card sets, it's roughly the same as playing a Mahjong pyramid or even just a game of solitaire. It's a gambling system, offering you the illusion of choice in exchange for rewards and penalties. It rewards you enough to make you feel good and smart, and it penalizes you enough to make you feel stupid and try again. At its core, Slay the Spire is a way to pass the time that can easily become addicting. But let's get back to the art of this game's storytelling and why it's so important. Like I said at the start of this video, the only stories in games are the ones we tell. If we value a game by its ability to allow us to tell more of our own story of how it was played, then Slay the Spire is one of the most important games ever made. It is as frustrating as it is fascinating. It is as rich in meaning as it is devoid of meaning. Its emptiness can only be filled by the life of the player. This is the extraordinary potential of video games to create meaning in our lives. It is also the extraordinary danger of game design to reduce all meaning to itself. In the end, what Slay the Spire gives to the player is the feeling of experiencing a unique, self-told narrative of wins and losses that no other player could possibly experience. That's what drives a lot of the discussion on Slay the Spire Reddit boards. Players put up screenshots of odd moments that no other player has experienced exactly that way, but recognize as something that could happen. There's less of a collective identification with specific narrative-based moments in video games like, for example, the traumatic opening of Mass Effect 2, or the reunion of Kiryu and Haruka at the end of Yakuza 5. These are moments we would share with each other the way we would share a scene from a movie or a passage from a book. Sharing memories of Slay the Spire, however, is to share unique memories. Every playthrough of a run, whether it's a win or a loss, is a unique micro-narrative that fits into a larger one. This makes the process of memory sharing perhaps more compelling than it would be for a movie or a TV show. If we're all seeing the same thing, what unique thing can we say about it? There's another side to this, of course, that the uniqueness of the narrative for each player of Slay the Spire could actually make it less compelling to talk about. Sort of like talking about our own dreams. We all have unique dreams, but do we really want to hear a narrative of someone else's dreams? Yes, all of us players know the rules of the game, and we can see what makes a shared memory special. But if all of our memories of the game are unique and special, is any of it really that special? What is so important about somebody else's story of playing Slay the Spire when everybody who plays the game has their own story to tell? Another thing is that the game has no human opponents. There's just a program. Winning a run in Slay the Spire is essentially no different from winning a game of solitaire. There is some competitiveness among players, seeing who can set world records for the number of consecutive wins at the highest levels. Top-tier players of Slay the Spire find deep meaning in the idea of win streaks across multiple characters at the highest Ascension. I hate to say this, but if any halfway intelligent person can figure this game out and beat it at a high level, who cares if someone else can do it 50 times in a row? I mean, I appreciate these top players for sharing their knowledge of the game's intricacies and recommending things to beginner players. They really do help a lot. But the competitive arena created by these players to top themselves and each other is to me a kind of lunacy. And I love it. Anyway, my own story isn't as spectacular, although it's probably a little lunatic. After hundreds of hours fighting these stupid monsters with unnamed characters and randomly generated cards, I look at the title of this game and think it's something of a joke. Slay the Spire? Yeah, sure, whatever you say, dollface, the Spire is never slain. All that's being slain is time. Once I came to that realization and shifted my thinking from trying to win the game to trying to figure out how it works, a couple of things happened. I got a much clearer sense of what this game is all about, I enjoyed it a lot more, and I got very, very good at it. I managed to kill the corrupt heart at Ascension 20 with 2 characters, the Ironclad and the Silent. I'm not sure I can get there with the other 2 characters, the Defect and the Watcher. I got pretty close with the Defect, but got screwed over by such horrendous card draws that I suspect the game just didn't want me to win as the Defect. This game was a real heartbreaker, and it wasn't the corrupt heart that was broken, it was mine. And the Watcher, well, I thought I liked the Watcher, and I'm awfully good as the Watcher, as most players are, but I'm just not that compelled to play her all the way up to level 20. Something about that character just doesn't make it as much fun as the others. She is literally two-dimensional, going from calm to wrath to calm to wrath. Kind of boring, actually. In closing, I had a friend who passed away some years ago who had a favorite quote, a quote that he made up. The quote is, "There are no happy endings in life, just good times along the way." I like that quote because it puts pleasure at the top of a value system. As a pleasurable diversion, video games should aspire to the same thing, not a narratively driven closed ending like you get in a movie or a TV show, but a compelling series of choices whose values are decided by the player. Players should have no problem quitting a game when it stops being pleasurable. Slay the Spire challenges the player to find that spot, that unique and subjective spot where a game crosses over from being pleasurable to being painful and back again. I didn't learn much about the Spire in Slay the Spire, or the monsters, or the characters who fought them, but I did learn a lot about what I like in a game experience and what I don't like in a game experience. And I also learned about the push and pull of stimulation and frustration that the most challenging games can generate. But it's time to close out and move on. The story must have an ending, and I guess this will have to be it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. So I wrote this epilogue during the production of this video because some things came up while I was making it. Like Slay the Spire itself, there seems to be no end to this story. First, I did beat the game, including the Corrupt Heart at Ascension level 20 with both the Defect and the Watcher. The Defect was a nice win because it felt like redemption for that very unfair loss I took earlier, as you saw in the video. I beat the heart with a nicely developed Dark Orb that I could evoke just at the right time. With the Watcher, I actually got over my boredom with the character and brought her all the way up to Ascension 20. I defeated the heart by building the Watcher around a strength relic I got randomly at the very beginning of the run. I used a card called Conjure Blade, an X-cost card, to make another card called the Expunger, which had a basic attack of 9 multiplied by whatever energy the Watcher had when the card was made, an additional 3 strength from the random relic, and then a doubling of the total by my Wrath stance, made a card that could deliver 188 damage to a heart that had only 120 health remaining. The Expunger may not be my favorite card, but it has what might be my favorite sound effect in the game. So take that, Spire. Secondly, I thought that was it, but I thought I'd also try out some of the custom game options, specifically the Endless mode that kept cycling your character through all 3 acts, keeping all your relics and cards from each run, while scaling all the monsters up accordingly. I went the distance with all 4 characters, getting to the point where I simply could not lose. I had to voluntarily quit each endless run, otherwise who knows how long it would go on. But they were definitely satisfying experiences. It's a way for a player to feel completely overpowered, slamming through the spire like a maniac. I had so much fun taking down these monsters with insanely overpowered heroes and collecting oodles of cash and relics. With the Watcher, I had to quit after over 300 floors when I realized I am simply unable to lose, and I had collected just about every single relic that was available from the shops and events. I finished my run with 7 circlets, which are special relics you can take when there are just empty spots where relics should be in a normal run. At this point, I can honestly say maybe I haven't slain the Spire, but I've given it a pretty good smack. My thanks to Megacrit for the many, many, many hours of pleasure and pain I've gotten from this game. And thirdly, on a related and final note, I wanted to mention with regard to the idea of winning or losing the game based on either luck or skill, there was actually an academic article written on this very idea. I came across this during my production of the video and thought I'd mention it. The conclusion of this article may be obvious, but it's worth some reflection. According to the study, statistically speaking, players of Slay the Spire who were more comfortable with high-risk decisions, meaning those who more frequently selected cards and relics which have random qualities to them, had a higher percentage of wins than players who were less comfortable with randomness. What this means essentially is that the more you play Slay the Spire, the more you are comfortable with randomness, the more you win, and therefore, the more you play. Because winning in a game of chance is much more exciting and, yes, addictive than winning in a game of pure skill. This is what makes the story of Slay the Spire unique to every player, and also never-ending, unless the player wants to end it. And I guess here is where I will definitely end this story. Thanks for watching.